Welcome back, everyone. I am excited to be back here again, helping you explore this whole process and the possibilities involved with it. First thing I wanted to mention, I made some changes to the syllabus just in terms of the sequence of topics. I don't think I changed anything in terms of like what is due or when. So you can download an updated version of the syllabus, just, so you know what we're going to talk about on a given day. And that's just because I'm kind of figuring out as I go how much I have to say about different things. For today's class, I have actually integrated what I've written out as two different sessions worth of material, but I was always a little bit skeptical about spending, close to 75 minutes talking about contacting prospective advisors ahead of time. So I decided to put a little bit more weight on some other application and admissions related topics coming up. And just having new ideas about what we might want to cover and how. So that's why I have switched things around a little bit. So hopefully this will work well. We'll see how much more I end up editing about our plans by the time we get to the end of the semester. But for now, this seems pretty good. So we will get to these two questions today. I'm trying to decide which programs you'd like to apply to, and also, some details about how best to contact prospective advisors before you apply, since that's something that I've been strongly encouraging. Last time we had our discussion with PhD students. I hope you found that really interesting. And before that, in terms of, my last more lecture type class, we talked about when to apply, whether to apply like this semester or allow some time in between your undergraduate and graduate studies. We learned that most PhD students in this particular graduate program, about 60% of them did something else, whether it was work in an academic lab or master's or postdoc program or working in industry. Most of them did something else between their bachelor's and PhD programs. But that doesn't necessarily mean that one path or another is the right one for you. And that, really is, a matter for individual consideration. So, getting into today's topic, in terms of deciding where to apply, I guess the first bit of advice that I thought I would throw out is just, maybe apply to roughly 5 to 10 programs. And the idea there is that, well, you might not get into all of them. It's nice to have some choices at the end of the day. So, this is my rough advice. And, if anything, I might nudge a little toward the upper end of that range, perhaps. But, one downside of this is that, unfortunately, universities still have application fees. And so, you might end up spending more than $500 applying to this many graduate programs. So keep that in mind. Now, if money is a serious issue for you, it is definitely worth asking programs about the possibility of getting a fee waiver. And programs handle this in different ways. For our program, I actually had them put a link on our program website for prospective students to basically an online form they can fill out if they would like to ask for for an application fee waiver. But it does cost our program money to do that. And so, I have, I ask for a little bit of information that is partly meant to assess whether they are, at least potentially competitive to be accepted to our program. I don't want to give them a waiver and then find out they've never done research. So it is definitely worth asking about, if there are serious financial challenges for you in terms of being able to afford this. And that might, in many cases, be something that you do have to just, write an email to them and specifically ask about it. There might not be anything on the web, but that doesn't mean that there isn't some possibility. If you have, limited income, limited savings, limited family support, that could be something to think about. Within this 5 or 10 university recommendation, I would say it's worth having some span in terms of, from talking to people, especially like how difficult you think it might be to get in there. Like if you decide you're going to apply to 7 and, you choose, only programs that you think are the very, very best. Well, okay, maybe you're ready to get into those programs. I don't know. But, if not, well, that'd be unfortunate. So you want a decent number of attempts. I mean, there's some variability, there's some stochasticity in the admissions process that is not 100% tied to your merit as an applicant. And so, it's good to have more than just a few. Because it can be difficult for you to assess, like, where you stack up amongst prospective applicants to graduate programs in general. That's why I provide the second bit of advice as well. So don't be like my former undergrad who, even after I gave the best advice I could, reported back that he had applied to Berkeley and only Berkeley for grad school. And he didn't get in, and, then just decided to do other things. When he told me, what? What can you do? So, that's what not to do. But, I guess he just kind of felt like trying out that little dream, which is not to say that you can't get into Berkeley. Although, do some careful budgeting there in terms of the cost of living if you do. Yeah, it's worth, applying to multiple programs, and even 1 or 2 that you're pretty sure you could get into, assuming that your priority is to start grad school at this time, or whenever it is that you are applying. We're going to say more about which programs to choose later on, but I feel like, this bit about contacting faculty is actually kind of upstream of that question. So, why apply to a program if the faculty that interest you most there are not taking students? So you want to have these contacts on the front end. So I don't know how many of you had time to actually read through the advice that our current grad students gave you on my survey about when to start grad school. I put this all in one big long announcement on the Canvas page. So it's all there. This is just one tiny little excerpt that I remembered and seemed very relevant to what we were talking about today. And so when this student, who's in our program now, talked about previous rounds of application and in terms of contacting faculty, they said, this is something I wasn't aware of when I first applied, and as a result got rejected from a lot of direct admit programs because they didn't know me. We talked about the differences between direct admission versus program admission with a rotation option, and that can vary. It varies between different areas of biology to a significant extent. But, even within a program, both of these models can be in play, as in the case of UW Genetics. So, that this might entail a delay to that student's progression, and maybe that was good or maybe not, I don't know. It definitely entailed some wasted money in terms of application fees, unless there are waivers involved. So I know that this can be challenging, from where you sit right now, to write to these, these professors, some of whom might be quite prominent in their field, and you don't know them. It's an individual thing, but for many people in your situation, that can be a hard thing to do. But I just want to emphasize that you have to do it anyway. It is important and you should do it. And one thing I wanted to, to just encourage you there is that, generally speaking, faculty are very happy to hear from you. So, anytime they hear from a prospective graduate student, that's going to make them happy that, that their research, area and their accomplishments are appealing enough that you would potentially want to study with them. And so, expect that kind of positive reaction. There are caveats there, like, sure, they're trying to assess, on a very initial level, like, is this, the type of student I'm looking for? And, also be aware they won't all respond. That's unfortunate. I've mentioned before, like, I respond to any real, inquiry that comes my way. Any inquiry that is even somewhat well aligned with my area of research, and that doesn't seem like it was just broadcast to thousands upon thousands of professors. I will respond, even to tell them that I'm not expecting to take a student this year, but not everyone will. And that is generally nothing about you that leads to that lack of response. Instead, it means that faculty member is very preoccupied right now and is not doing a perfect job of responding to emails that they don't absolutely have to respond to. That's a fact of life. And, some faculty can be more like that than others. It depends what's going on for them. It depends on, them as individuals. And that's all right. How you interpret a lack of response is another question, to what extent do you want to write them off? I in your position, I would be a little more positive about someone who writes back than somebody who doesn't. And if they don't, well, you can't confirm that they're interested in taking students the next year. So, and you might think, well, they seem a bit overloaded already. And, it's something to think about in terms of the time you need from them as a mentor. You could always try a second time. Lately, I've noticed even the spam ones will kind of send a second message, saying they didn't hear back from me. Like, okay, but you want to do something totally different than I do. Okay. This seems a little bit, yeah, I don't know. So, there's no reason you can't send a really, polite second email, 2 or 3 weeks later. But, the reason to do this is, partly for you, like to assess whether they're taking students, but it's partly, because it gives a very positive impression to the faculty member, that you're thinking ahead. It puts you on their radar. It's good for faculty to know that they might have, potentially interested students for the next year. might even affect other decisions they make about how to spend their money in the interim, because they only have so much funding to go around. So, it can only help. And as the quote that I showed a little bit ago indicates, it is, I would say, nearly essential for direct admit opportunities. Now and then you might have a student, like a professor, that would reach out to someone who didn't write to them, even in a direct admit program. But by and large, this direct admit is only likely to happen if the applicant is pursuing it, more directly. But I think that this is a really beneficial thing, even for rotation programs. If it comes up, by any way that that a student has made contact with professors, you're free to mention this in your essay, for one thing. And not that you have to, but you can. There's nothing negative there. There's no reason not to, I guess. Not saying it'll make a huge difference in your probability of getting an interview, but it's a good thing. Also, like if a professor on the admissions committee said I heard from them in advance, I mean, again, it's a small thing, but it's a good thing. Or even later in the process, like, if you're going to do interviews and the professor gets an email from the program saying, do you have time to meet with these 5 students? Sometimes, the busy professor response is like, no. So, I mean, it can help if they recognize your name. It can only help, basically, to have that early contact, rather than just popping up, in a more anonymous way later in the admission cycle. So, even if you're interviewing for a program where you might go and rotate with faculty, it's still worth doing. It's still a positive for sure. It can only help, so why not do it? One of the things that I'm suggesting in terms of these interactions is to try to set up a conversation of some type with faculty you might be interested in working with. And that interaction might give you an initial impression of whether you might actually like to spend 5 or 6 years working with this person. Are your styles and personalities compatible? Are their expectations compatible with yours in terms of the mentor-mentee relationship? I'm guessing that's one thing that you might have found really eye-opening about our last class session with the grad student discussion, is that, and this might be kind of a chance thing, but 2 out of the 6 PhD students who were here had switched labs. In each case, because they had not been happy with the mentor relationship in their first lab. I don't think a third of students end up jumping labs during their PhD, but it's not a trivial proportion. And so that's relevant to consider. Just that isn't something that always works out. And in these cases, I think, they each left labs that might have worked out just fine or even really well for another student, just depending on the individuals involved and the expectations involved. But on the other hand, I think they had entirely, I trust that they had very valid reasons for leaving as well. But on the other hand, there do exist labs which seem to shed students very frequently. And so, it's worth asking around. It's worth talking to lab members as well. So, it's always good to try to, assess what you can about whether you might like to work with a given faculty mentor. So focusing on just this initial contact, I know I'm getting kind of ahead of myself there, but what should you be including in an email to prospective mentors? It doesn't have to be that complicated. So for one thing, make sure the title of your email gets the point across. Don't just put something kind of nebulous, like about your lab or something like that. um, Make sure that the title actually conveys that that you are a potential graduate student for their lab. And then say some things about yourself. So, if you're applying this semester, you could say that you're a senior here. You can optionally include your CV. We're not going to talk about the contents of the CV for a little bit of time yet, a couple of weeks maybe. But that's sometimes something that students send along, but I don't feel like it's essential. I do feel like you should talk about your background as a prospective student in that lab, which should include something about the research that you've already done. And try to convey a little enthusiasm both for what you've done and for what they do, I would say. And try to I would say, try to even not just talk about like what was your research about and what you did, but like, what was the goal? Like, what was the question involved? Faculty like that kind of thing. They like to know that you're thinking about what you're doing and why. And it's worth, pointing out skills that you might have picked up along the way, either in the email or at least if not there, you could put it in the CV if you're including that. That makes some difference anyway. Make sure you've conveyed, why, you already have at least some relevant background to work in their lab. Faculty have to expect that most of what their students are going to need to know, they're going to have to learn in grad school, in terms of conceptual background and skills. But the more you can say about what you've already got, the better. And then, perhaps most importantly, talk about why their research interests you. And, try to make it clear that, that you've actually done a little bit of homework on their lab. So, don't just like, don't just say that, don't just say like, I am interested in your research in neurobiology, end of topic. Don't just like, don't just like copy and paste a forward research description from a website that you found for that lab. So you can at least browse some abstracts, if not papers from a given lab. I know that you might not be able to read like multiple whole papers from every faculty member you write to, but look at look at what they've published lately. Focus, I would say, on papers where that faculty member is the last author, because those reflect the papers that were really led by that lab. The others, may have less to do with that lab's primary research directions. Those recent papers from the lab are the best ones probably to speak to in terms of expressing why the research in that lab interests you. Then lastly, provide, some direction for follow-up here. So what are you looking for? My suggestion is to try to set up some kind of conversation with them. Try to schedule some sort of call, like by Zoom or phone. And if that's impossible, you could continue to interact by email. Keeping this interaction going a bit, is to your advantage. At least, having some sort of further exchange is ideal here. And, you know, if you have that call, I didn't do like a whole slide on this, but, you know, you can talk further about both your research background and interests and potential projects in that lab. You can also ask about, you know, that professor's expectations for their students in all different respects, ask what is important to them, ask, what their philosophy of mentoring is, ask what they're looking for in their graduate students, ask, ask whether they tend to pursue, you know, a more kind of very actively engaged, mentoring style, or more of a hands-off mentoring style. One of those is not better than the other. It depends on what you're looking for. And what they expect in terms of even like schedule in the lab, if that's important to you. That was a topic that came up last time as well. So, there's plenty of things you could talk about. Time could go quick. But that would be my suggestion in terms of the kind of overall content here. I'm not going to give any more of a template than this for this kind of email, because, authentically, this should be something that you come up with. And so, we do have, of course, coming up this kind of a draft email along these lines. So, pick any professor at any other university and write something to them. You don't have to send it. Like if you're not actually applying for graduate programs this year, you don't have to ever click send on that, but you have to draft it and submit it for this assignment. Yes. Mm-hmm.
How soon is that too early?
It's not too early, even now.
So if you were applying, say,
oh, like in a future year? Or okay. That's a good question. Okay. Yeah. So for this year, it is not too early. And for generally for future years, that is a good question. I think I've gotten emails even several months ahead. And that seemed totally reasonable to me. I guess I probably wouldn't suggest writing more than about half a year before the deadline in question. I don't know, it's not wrong, but I mean, the faculty member may have less and less idea whether they would actually be accepting students. There might be things that still need to get resolved. Their grant proposals will or won't be funded. Their senior grad student will or won't finish by then. So they might have a better idea later on whether they will be or won't be taking students. And I mean, you don't want them to forget you by the time you apply either. So, if you feel like there's a particular benefit to you from, getting more of an idea sooner, it's not necessarily a bad thing to check in with them way ahead. But generally, I think I've perhaps only heard from students, or almost only heard from prospective students, like, within half a year before the application deadline, and more often during the fall specifically. So, I've often heard from students in sometimes September, often October, sometimes November for, December 1st application deadline. And yeah, so I'm going to come back to that in some way in a minute, but kind of on the flip side. This is a kind of a challenging sort of cost benefit to consider. because I talked about, potentially wanting to end up applying to 5 or 10 different schools. Well, you can, if you only contact faculty at, let's say 7 schools, you might conclude after doing so that, only 3 or 4 of them really have opportunities worth applying for. In other cases, faculty aren't responding, or they're not expecting to be taking students. So, that's why I suggested here you might want to contact faculty at somewhere between 8 and 12 universities, so that you can whittle that down in terms of which ones you ultimately apply to, partly based on the outcomes of these contacts. And I've sometimes heard from students who didn't end up applying. And so then the question is, how many faculty should you be contacting at each of those schools? And so this gets into kind of a multiplier here. But, I'm not really so sure about, applying for grad school if there's really only one lab there you'd want to work with. Partly because what if it doesn't work out? Even if we're talking about a direct admit situation, it doesn't always work out. And then what? It helps if there's another lab you might be happy to move to, at least. And if it's a rotation program, it's nice to really be able to make use of that, to do multiple rotations in labs that you might actually want to join, so that you can really consider, how those experiences went for you, and also confirm that that lab still has space for you after rotations. So, like if there aren't at least 2 faculty that you'd want to send an email like this to, well, maybe you just write it off to begin with. And, ideally, you probably want to be sending emails to, more like 3 or 4 faculty at a given place, on average. But again, there's a multiplier involved here. So, if you're sending an average of 3 or 4 emails to different faculty at each, at somewhere between 8 to 12 universities, then you're probably talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 or 40 of these emails going out. And you'll gain a ton of information from that, but it'll take you some time to write that many emails that reflect any degree of effort on your part in terms of expressing why that lab's research interests you, and in terms of, for a subset of them, actually setting up these conversations, because again, they won't all reply, but some of them will. And so, you might end up, setting up, a dozen or 2, Zoom calls or whatever. That takes time too. And so I realized that that's, something to take on, in the midst of your, full-time academic schedule, and quite possibly your active research, at the same time. But, if you want to get the most out of, this experience, if you want to get the best outcomes from applying to PhD programs, this is what I would recommend. So the next topic, coming back to, although I don't have anything here about the early end, so I'm glad for that question. So if you're thinking to apply this year, this is a great time to write. These next few weeks are great. I guess it, writing like in October does come across better than like writing, on November 30th or something, like, the day before you have to apply to the program, or writing after the deadline. Still maybe better to be in touch, but it doesn't give quite the same impression in terms of having your stuff together. then, versus writing some weeks ahead of the deadline. And of course, I mentioned this upcoming assignment that is due in 2 weeks via Canvas. I believe that is still accurate. So yeah, any questions? Thought this is, yes, okay, my slides are a little out of order now. Is your head still just spinning from the idea of writing that many emails and having that many Zoom calls? Whatever you manage to do will help. But I'm trying to lay out the ideal scenario here anyway. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What sets students apart? I guess, I would say two things. One is any initial assessment that I'm able to make on, just how strong a candidate I perceive them to be based on what they have sent to me. And that can be based on their description of the research that they've done to date, both everything from how they write about it to what it was about, to the skills that entailed. It's all relevant to just how much there was, like, is research something they started doing 2 months ago, or is it something that they've been doing for like 3 or 4 years? All of that makes a difference. To some degree, academic stuff could make a difference. Like, is that going to help them get into our program, or is that going to be more of an obstacle? We'll talk more about that in future classes. Yeah, so there's that side of it. And then the other side of it, I would say, is, how are they expressing their interest in my lab's research? Does it seem like, they have, looked into our work at least a bit? It can often be challenging for them to do, maybe it's a time thing in part, but also just interfacing with, the level of detail of modern research. It can often be hard for them to do more than just kind of write, like, I'm interested in this kind of general area of research that you guys do. And that's okay. But if they're able to actually, like, show that they have, read and understood, even a paper or two from what we've published, and to express interest related to that, that is a big plus. And I would say, like, I don't know, maybe the holy grail on that side, which is rarer yet, would be if a student was able to independently identify and articulate potential follow-up directions to that research. I have encountered that on rare occasions, whether in pre-application interactions or during interviews, but it's extremely impressive when it happens.
So since you're emailing, how do you strike balance between
That's a good point. Yes. you want to hit these notes that I talked about, but maybe it is worth kind of going back through after you've drafted some initial text and, asking, well, what could I pare down a bit? Because you're right. Length can be an issue. Sometimes I tend to write longer emails, and I feel like even with my colleagues, sometimes that may affect their their speed or response at all. um, so yeah, I feel like that can matter. I think it's worth being succinct as long as you can convey what we're talking about. That could be, a case for having kind of a punchy email, but like attaching a CV, which could convey more about you. So that way you don't have to drone on about your every research skill that you've learned in the body of the email that you're sending to each faculty member. At the same time, you might want to highlight things that you find especially important, because there's no guarantee that they're going to open any attachment that you provide. So yeah, there's a balance there, between saying more about yourself, saying more about your interest in their work, and so I don't feel like you need to keep it to just a few sentences. And even if they're just kind of scanning it, like, if they care to respond at all, maybe there is something especially impressive about, a student who is, showing that they've really engaged with that lab's research in particular. It's easy for you to write a fair bit about yourself if you want to. It's harder to write that much about the research of any given lab that you're contacting the professor of. So that is impressive, I have to say, and that probably offsets concerns about time. But the other thing I think that can help is just to structure your email, in a logical way. So like if there's if there's a paragraph where you kind of introduce yourself, and spend maybe 2 or 3 sentences talking about your research background, then a paragraph expressing why you're interested in that lab especially, and then separate paragraph at the end, asking if they would be open to having a brief Zoom call with you in the coming weeks, and if so, when might they be available? So make your request very clear at the bottom. That's about all I could suggest, probably. It's tough. It can be tough to get responses, but that's it's worth seeing who actually puts the time into responding to you. Yeah, the back first. Mhm. Oh, right. Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah, so you're right. One of our PhD students last time seems to have a co-advised relationship between 2 different labs that are collaborating with each other. I think that's the easiest way for that sort of arrangement to arise is, if 2 labs are either collaborating already or would like to, um, you know, um, I don't know if I don't know if I've seen that really emerge on like, a pre-admission basis. It could be worth, like if there's a specific interface between 2 labs that interest you, or especially if you can see that there's already been a collaboration between 2 labs at the same institution, that might be, kind of a ready to go opportunity. to be in those two labs. I think there are pros and cons to being in two labs. I think, it can often be a good thing. It's not super common, really. I don't know if there's any other student in our program. Maybe there's one other student who's co-advised by two faculty, but this is out of like 50 or 60. So, it's on the rarer side, and it might often be something that emerges once a student is actually in a program, and they might start off in one lab and then become co-advised by another lab. I think that might have been the case with this student. So, maybe they start in one lab and then, they're kind of drawn to the interface between that lab's work and another, and maybe they kind of add a co-advisor. I think it might be rarer for that to be kind of set up on the front end, again, unless there's a particular active collaboration already. But if there's something that interests you, it can't hurt to ask about it. Question here? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll step into that a little bit here, but you know, most labs have like a research website that talks about active research directions. Sometimes they get a little out of date, but it's also just worth looking at their recent papers, because those often reflect you know, ongoing research directions as well. Uh-huh. Right. Yeah, well, I mean, I guess my main suggestion would be to just, focus on what interests you most within their range of projects. All right. So, getting into, certainly one important factor is like, where are there specific faculty you might like to work with? Ideally more than one who might be interested in working with you. Otherwise, like, where should you apply? So I would say, some of the ideal factors would be, that you feel like, this is a strong program for research in your particular scientific area. And, this is easier to assess kind of as you go along. Maybe not, maybe not trivial to assess at any stage, but, at least as you get a chance to interact with more individuals, not only faculty, but potentially lab members. Sometime during the interview process, you can ask questions related to this, but trying to find a place that really feels like it has, a supportive culture toward mentorship and, student scientific and career development is certainly an important factor. Of course, it helps if you can get into that program. And the other thing, that I will emphasize again in the future is just, this is also going to be a place where you would spend a non-trivial fraction of your time on Earth. So, and you want a place that'll help kind of keep you going and keep you motivated, keep you happy for the next several years. So, big picture, these would be great things. And so I'll say a little bit about, how you might find the programs that merit applying to, but I want to first, just emphasize maybe what I would say not to do. And so I would say don't focus on like lists you find online of top universities in a given field. So, for example, like I for fun, I looked up the US News top graduate schools for genetics and genomics. And, I was glad that the UW was in the top 10, but on the other hand, for my particular area of genetics, I would say that probably, at least 3 or 4 out of that top 10 are not even good at the type of genetics that I do, and wouldn't really be, ideal targets for, for prospective PhD students, because they just haven't happened to really go after, my area of genetics. There aren't really, people there to work with. They're fine institutions, but even at really good universities, often, their scientific coverage is sort of patchy. They might be really strong in, this area of ecology, but not in that area, or, this area of microbiology, but not that area. And so, how do you figure out, well, who's good in your area of interest? Because, I have advocated trying to focus your interests by the time you apply on a particular, area of a biological field, a particular subfield, as I call it. And so, that comes in large part from talking to people who work in that area, as I'll come back to in a moment. And the other thing I would emphasize is, don't feel like, general public sort of perceptions of a university's prestige need to be a major factor in your decision, because it's not really going to be that important in terms of, your future in science. There are universities that are fantastic in science, and most people have never heard of them because they don't have sports teams or whatever. So, there's that consideration. And, sometimes even at some of the most prestigious universities, maybe the culture for students is not that positive. Maybe people are a little more cutthroat and a little less supportive. I can't say that I've never heard that from, people who have been to, some of the very most famous universities in the US. So, that's really not what it's about in science, and don't feel like you're, giving up something incredible, if you choose to, go to a slightly, a university that the general public would consider slightly less prestigious than another. So this is my what not to do slide, basically. So what to do instead? So first, talk to faculty, including those right here at UW, who work in your area of interest. And you could talk to other people too, postdocs, senior grad students, because these are the people who can really point you toward places that are great places to do research in your area of interest, and even specific labs. In some cases, they might even know something about the culture and supportiveness of a given department or program, or even which individual faculty might be good mentors or not such good mentors. And if they have some sense of you as an applicant in terms of your research experience, and your academic background and so on, then they might have at least a rough sense of which programs you might be competitive for now, or might become competitive for in the future. And so this is all potentially very helpful. It's certainly worth layering your own research on top of that in terms of grad programs. I have to admit, I'm getting, I've gotten the impression that these days, a lot of our students who apply to our program and get interviewed, because I survey them, a lot of them say that they found us based on their own research rather than being recommended by an advisor or anyone else. So that's clearly important for many applicants, although not all applicants have the resources available to them that you do, being here at the University of Wisconsin. So you might as well make use of, the advice that is potentially all around you. And so, you can, do your own research. You could start by, the stuff that I talked about last time, about I've talked a little bit about this before in terms of identifying a research area of interest to you. That was a few classes ago. Likewise, you could find individual labs by looking for recent papers that you're especially fascinated by, or you could start with a recent review article on a topic that really interests you, and look up specific, research papers that are cited within that review. That might lead you to labs where you really like the research that's going on there. And, you can look at these lab web pages that are usually out there. Not every faculty member has one. I can't figure out why not, to be honest. I think it's good for them, and it's also good for the people in their lab, actually. They get a little exposure there generally. But not all labs have one. Most of the more active labs do, but not all. And so, look at these lab web pages and, see what they've got going on, and consider whether you want to add that lab to your list. Or, look up labs that were mentioned by someone you talked to here, for example. And so, you have a list of labs. So, how might you evaluate whether you want to contact that faculty member? Here are some potential considerations. One is just lab size. And, this might be something where, different individuals might thrive better in slightly different environments. But, I would say, you might want to give a little bit of extra thought, at least, if a lab is either very large or very small. You might think, well, very large means very successful. They must have a lot of funding. They're probably publishing a ton. But, keep in mind that the advisor's time is sort of a, a fixed sized pie. And so, your slice of that can only be so big. Now, you might learn from others in the group, maybe postdocs or senior grad students, but keep in mind, the professor's time itself may be somewhat more limited from your perspective. And on the other side of things, if a lab is very tiny, there's not as many people to talk to, at least in that lab. Maybe you could interact with others in other labs, but it's hard to say. Funding might or might not be limited. There might be reasons that they're at the small size they are. The one exception that I would make there, though, is that is for new labs. Now, there are things to consider in terms of potentially working with pre-tenure faculty. So the faculty track goes assistant professor, associate professor, full professor. Assistant professor is generally the pre-tenure phase. So these faculty have not achieved a guarantee of long-term ongoing employment at the institution. They will go up for tenure. They will apply for tenure. The vast majority of them will succeed, but some minority of them won't. So that's something to think about. And that may seem, kind of scary, but, because what if you're only a couple of years into your PhD and your advisor has to leave? Well, different things could happen. They might get a job somewhere else. You might be able to move with them, or else switch to a different lab at that university where you want to stay. So, I know that could be a little off-putting to consider. But I have noticed that, especially, I feel like the first student or maybe the first few students of a new professor often seem to do especially well. I feel like they often get some really cool research projects, for one thing, like, the research projects that convinced that department to hire that professor in the first place. Obviously, an academic department, when they're evaluating potential faculty members, they want someone with some really cool research plans. And when a professor sets up a new lab, they're in part looking for people to do those projects that were interesting enough to get them that job, prospectively. So that often turns out well, I would have to say, even though, that student has to join a lab that's still kind of getting set up and there's no one else there at first, maybe, or maybe just like, one other person or something. So, there could be challenges there, but the other thing is, for a new faculty member, getting your first student, like I want all my students to succeed very badly, but like, I think especially for a professor's first student, they really want that to work out, they especially don't want their first student to fail. And so, that's a good thing from the student's perspective. And they're also not dividing their time amongst very many people. And they tend to be very energetic, like they're putting a lot into their work overall. So, that can actually turn out well. And then, on the other side of the scale, if you're considering labs of professors who have been around for a while, especially like if someone's title is just professor, if they're not assistant or associate professor anymore, they probably have previous PhD students who have moved on. And so by that point, it could be interesting, if you're super interested in the lab anyway, you don't have time to do this for every lab, but, it could be interesting to kind of get a sense of like, who are the previous PhD students. Often they'll be listed on the lab webpage, in kind of like a little alumni section. And it might be relevant to consider, both what they accomplished during their PhD, in particular, their publication record, and specifically publications that they led. So like they were the first author or co-first author on, because you'd rather, that is kind of like the currency of at least academic science, are especially first author or co-first author publications. You don't want to be in a situation where, and I think this is rare, but in some labs, it might be the case that grad students are kind of like helping out on projects that are led by postdocs. That's not ideal. But yeah, so what did they tangibly accomplish during their PhD? What did they go on to do? Like if have they gone on to successful careers, whether it's in academia or otherwise? How do you feel about the outcomes that their previous students have obtained? And that doesn't have to be the same outcome that you'll get, but it can be worth considering. So in terms of which programs to apply for, I've been talking about labs specifically. But based on the labs that you've identified, I've been suggesting that you probably want to focus on universities and specific programs at those universities that have at least a couple of labs that interest you. And so, you might put a university on your list either because, you found that lab or someone recommended that lab to you, or, maybe someone just recommended a particular university or program at a university to you based on a conversation here. One thing you need to do is for any given university, you need to figure out like, well, what are the PhD programs that I might like to apply to at that university? And so, so this can be a little bit challenging to navigate. I feel like, occasionally I see applications here at UW where it seems like an applicant may have missed the existence of a program that might be most relevant to their interests. It's worth, trying to take a close look there. Sometimes it's even mentioned on faculty web pages, which programs they can take students through. Sometimes, you might just look at which department they're in, and on the department website, it might kind of point you toward a specific graduate program. And so, getting down to this graduate program level, I would say the ideal case is if there's at least, 3 labs there that interest you. maybe 2 is okay, but ideally 3 or more labs. That way, if it's a rotation program and that's how you're coming into that program, then you have multiple good rotations, and hopefully one of them works out both ways in that kind of 2-way trial period. And the other thing is that having multiple faculty, that interest you might mean that you have some good options for members of your graduate committee. So graduate students not only have, their major professor, their advisor or mentor, but they have a graduate committee that might have, let's say, 4 other professors on it, usually, but not always from that university, not necessarily from the same grad program. And it can be good to have a little breadth on that committee, but this is also a potential benefit of having at least multiple faculty with relevant research interest to you. So that's what you'd ideally want to see in a particular program. I do want to point out that programs that, depending on the university, graduate programs may be structured in different ways. So for example, at UW, there are many more specific PhD programs. So, like there's different programs in genetics, in microbiology and biochemistry, in and there's like separately plant breeding and genetics, and so on and so forth. There's integrative biology, which is a broader program. There are, kind of other sort of taxonomically oriented programs like botany and entomology. The list goes on because this is an enormous biology community here. And here, our applicants can simultaneously apply to up to 3 of those. They could tailor the statement separately for each. But basically each of these programs makes their own decisions about who to admit. And students enter them, independently. At some schools, there are other arrangements. Some universities have, at least on the more molecular side of biology, which at many universities is pretty big. Like there are a lot of people doing it because there's a lot of funding there. On the more biomedical side of things. Generally speaking, that the NIH is a relatively well-funded public driver of science, and there are other mechanisms too for funding biomedically oriented research. So some universities have these umbrella programs that cover kind of a broad swath of molecular and biomedical science and biology. So what they often have students do is they apply to that umbrella program. Sometimes there's also an option to apply to specific programs separately. But if there is this umbrella program, then either that's it, and you're just in an enormous program, or in some cases, the umbrella program is just kind of a first year thing while the students kind of sort themselves into which program they want to join after that. So there's kind of different models in play here, and they offer different pros and cons. The UW sort of model with more tailored programs for a particular area of biology. In that way, in that scenario, you might enter with a relatively smaller group of students who have a somewhat more cohesive set of scientific interests, and also the curriculum of that program might be more tailored to the individuals in it. Whereas with an umbrella program, there's more initial flexibility on what to study. I think that especially appeals to students who have not quite pinned down their research interest to the degree that I have recommended. But the caveat here is that, you still got to end up in a lab, like within your first year. I think in some ways this might be offering a little bit of false assurance as far as like, do you need to figure out what you're going to do? So it doesn't really change my advice about like, where to be in you know, in resolving your scientific interests, but you know, it might be a good thing, especially for students who have interest kind of at the interface of two different fields. So, you know, like if someone's interests were like microbial genetics and they couldn't decide if they wanted to be in a microbiology program or a genetics program, you know, maybe they're happy if they don't have to, you know, be on one side or the other of that distinction. And you know, also depending on, you know, the individual and, you know, their personality and their kind of also their scientific personality, you know, they might or might not appreciate being with a larger group of incoming students who have more wide-ranging interests, you know, and to be in that, you know, larger program. So there is, again, there's not really a right or wrong answer here. It's more of an individual thing. And it might be secondary even to, I'd say it's definitely secondary to the, you know, the specific lab opportunities that exist at a particular university. I mentioned location earlier. You know, obviously for many people, geography is a consideration, whether it's how far from family they want to be, or other preferences about where to live. And, you know, I acknowledge that that's important. And, you know, although it can be worth considering places that are just new to you, and that could be an opportunity for growth. If there are places that you're pretty sure you wouldn't want to live, you know, then feel free not to apply there. There's no sense being miserable. You know, I think one funny thing is that, you know, like when I was applying for graduate programs, you know, I was drawn to one place that was very strong in my field of interest, but I wasn't sure I'd really want to live there. And, you know, when I was talking with a professor, you know, he asked me if I had any concerns, and I said I wasn't quite sure about that side of it yet. And he said something like, well, if you don't like it here, that'll just motivate you to finish faster. I was not terribly persuaded. I went somewhere else. So I went somewhere else that I ended up really liking living there. So, and yet, you know, someone else might have really liked the, you know, the first place that I mentioned and not like the place where I went. So as a place to live, it really is an individual thing. But yeah, I mean, you'll be there a little while. So, you know, that is fair to consider as well. Yeah, and you know, it can be worth considering living, you know, somewhere a little different than you're used to. You know, that can be valuable on a personal level, and being exposed to a new scientific sphere as well at that institution can be a good thing. Now, if you really wanted to broaden your horizons, I mean, you could consider graduate programs, you know, in a country where you haven't lived before. I know that not everyone in this room has grown up in the US. Now, I've been focusing largely on US-based programs. And so I want to acknowledge that there are limits in my knowledge about programs in other countries, but I'm aware that in many countries, including like in Europe, there is an expectation that you have earned a master's before you enter a PhD program. So the PhD program might be shorter in those places. It might be more like 3 years, but they do expect that you already have a master's before you come in. And so here, you know, I can't tell you everything that you might need to know. And so my advice is just to talk to people who would know about graduate study. So learn more from prospective faculty if this is an option that interests you. You know, there could be other opportunities to study internationally as well. You know, like, you know, I began my postdoctoral research phase in Denmark before my advisor actually then moved back to the US. But that is probably a more common time to, you know, to study in a different country, at least for people who grow up in the US. So, you know, that can be another opportunity if that's something that appeals to you. So that's all I've got for today. You know, we're at our end point anyway. For next time, I'm asking that you have your faculty conversation report sent in. I opened up an item for that on Canvas. For that, as with the PhD, like the PhD plan that was due today, I have that as a discussion item in Canvas because I felt like there might be benefits to you of just seeing that other students were, kind of dealing with similar questions that you are. But if you feel uncomfortable with, sharing any of these assignments, just send me an email, because it is also possible to, to send your assignment to me individually if there's something you're not comfortable sharing but would like to include in that assignment. So that's all I've got for this week. See you in 7 days.
Quick questions. You mentioned applying to multiple programs at the same school at the time.
Yeah.